I want to start with you, Duncan. Duncan's a VP for strategy at the Wilson Center, and you focus heavily on trying to understand these realities from a geopolitical standpoint of what really does this mean? What are we seeing and what are we likely to see moving ahead? So Duncan, let me send it to you first. Can you kind of give us a lay of the land from your perspective? And to our audience, I'll remind you, feel free to put chat in the chat function questions there, and then we'll do some at the back end as well with raising the hand. But Duncan?
Thanks, Maury, and thanks to everybody over there at Hearts and Minds, especially Bruce. Of course, it's great to be able to collaborate with you again, Bruce. Bruce was my boss for a while at the Wilson Center, and it's funny how in Washington all these things keep coming around again. Let me also comment on the timeliness, not just because of this event, not just because of what's happening in Ukraine, but also because of the thought process that we're undergoing at the Wilson Center right now. And we're launching a new project which looks at the implications of geopolitics for business strategy and investment strategies for companies. We had a preliminary meeting on that last week, and it's clear that it is a very rich vein to mine. Let me talk about now sort of the stunning changes that we're witnessing because of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's actions there. Obviously, the economic sanctions have taken a lot of the headlines in recent weeks. And we've seen a lot of folks raising doubts about whether they'll be effective or questioning their effectiveness. But there's no doubt that governments across the free world have taken these moves because they believe that they have no choice, that this is the only thing that they can possibly do so as to not be left out of the global compact against Russia at this point in time. Those economic sanctions have been far-reaching. They've been obviously concerning issues such as energy, but we've seen sanctions imposed on individuals, wealthy oligarchs, of course, and companies. And an interesting piece that was on the daily podcast from the New York Times this week, talking about why these sanctions are different to sanctions that have gone before. There is a much more comprehensive approach to understanding who's behind certain companies, shell companies, to understanding who owns what. And rather than in previous instances of sanctions, where it's just been, they've created a list of people and companies, now they're actively going after assets. And we see that with the confiscation of oligarchs' yachts and jets, etc. Those economic sanctions will be tested severely in the weeks and months ahead. We already saw Renault begin operations again in Russia, quickly shut them down again. But there will be this constant temptation on the part of companies to try to get around them just because of the pressure they're experiencing from their own shareholders. Energy dependence, a stunning change that we're witnessing there. A lot of folks who have been saying for years that Europe, in particular Germany, cannot depend this way on Russian oil and gas. But Germany went ahead anyway with the building of Nord Stream 2. And that has come to a grinding halt. And we're seeing a precipitous change in German energy policy away from Russia, which in the short term means probably compromising some of the steps they're taking on mitigating climate change and reducing emissions. But we're seeing a shift towards other forms of generating electricity, other sources of natural gas, including the United States. And that is one of the most important factors going on right now in terms of geopolitics, the opportunity for getting cheap US LNG across the Atlantic to Germany at a competitive price. Of course, it costs a lot more than pipeline gas, but at a competitive price so that Germany and other European states can actually produce electricity at a competitive rate. We're looking at the European Union taking stunning steps forward in terms of buying weaponry and mobilizing the military capacities of its member states, not in a NATO way, but basically talking about how the European Union can participate in a lot of these activities that NATO is undertaking. Germany, I mean, that is truly a stunning change, and we shouldn't minimize it, and we shouldn't forget about it. First of all, giving lethal assistance to Ukraine and boosting its military budget in such a way that it will become the largest military force in Europe once that money begins to flow through to its armed forces. That is a stunning change because, basically since 1945, we have seen a weakened Germany, a Germany that does not want to project power. And this completely changes the game in Europe. NATO, the news today coming out of Brussels, of course, 40,000 more troops to Eastern Europe, 4 battle groups moving there. We're seeing closer coordination between the NATO nations than we have done in recent memory. This unifying force that the Ukraine conflict has exerted on transatlantic relations, but in particular on European relations and on NATO relations. That's a stunning, stunning change. And it wasn't that long ago that we were questioning the future of NATO because of what President Trump had been saying about the need for Europeans to step up and spend more. That's something which I think is truly stunning at this point in time, to see that it's not that President Trump was wrong. The Europeans clearly have needed to spend more money on their defense. But this is what has actually got them to do it, is this existential threat that we're experiencing right now. Bruce spoke at length about the implications for supply chains, especially food, but and other commodities. But let's also talk about the implications for things such as semiconductors. We have a semiconductor supply chain project underway at the Wilson Center, and looking at the inert gases that are needed for semiconductors manufacturing. Ukraine is the world's largest producer of xenon, neon, argon, and krypton. That's something which our friends in the semiconductor industry are deeply worried about at this point in time. Russia's exports of palladium, of course, will also impact upon the semiconductor industry. A lot of this coming together means that we're having increasing conversations about nearshoring, reshoring, but also ally shoring. And that's a very important term for us to embrace at this point in time. And that is about making our manufacturing processes, our manufacturing platforms integrated amongst friendly nations. And I think that's something that will grow in importance in the weeks and months ahead. To wrap up, let me just give you a quick idea of how I see things shaping up in the future. Today, Larry Fink published his letter to shareholders, in which he basically said that globalization as we know it is now over. And he started talking about the implications of the Russia conflict for investors and for companies. A lot of the things that we've already talked about in terms of economic sanctions are there. But I see this actually as a real watershed in our understanding of geoeconomics. From this point forward, companies are going to be held responsible by governments, by watchdogs, by shareholders, by consumers, by the gatekeepers, and by that I mean particularly investors, for their investment decisions, and questioning why they would be investing in a country which does not meet global standards in terms of democracy, in terms of being friendly with the United States, in terms of issues like corruption, in terms of human rights, etc. This is a truly watershed moment. Let me emphasize that. We're going to ask questions like, who is the government? What is its relationship with the United States? Is it authoritarian? Is it corrupt? And here we begin to see a continuum between issues of ESG that have been floating around for a long time and becoming increasingly important. A continuum from ESG through to geopolitics. That crossover that we've seen so many times between corruption and abuse of human rights, corruption and environmental negligence or active damage. We're also seeing now, at least intellectually speaking, the crossover between authoritarian regimes and the possibility for them going rogue and causing a severe disruption in the international system, in particular, if they are regimes that are opposed or unfriendly to the United States. Long term, all of these things are going to play through, and I can't tell you exactly how they're going to play through, but I will exercise one word of caution before I end. And that is just to say that in the short and medium term, the United States is going to find itself in a position where it needs uncomfortable partners. And we think here, of course, about countries like Turkey and Hungary, who are right there, very close to the conflict, but also, of course, the moves that we've seen in recent weeks to persuade Venezuela to produce more oil to lessen the impact of the ban on Russian oil going to the United States. We can see a lot of that. It's kind of like going back to the Cold War era and saying that a certain dictator was a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. I think we're going to have that in the short to medium term, but ultimately we are seeing a change in the nature of geoeconomics and a really deep change in the nature of global investing. Thank you, Maury.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Quick follow-up, and then I want to go to cybersecurity and then energy. But Ben brought up a good question here. The narrative up until now has been in the decline of the U.S. influence globally. And now you see President Biden with G7, with NATO, with the EU, and the efforts to move forward. Any sense on what does this say about the future of U.S. global influence, given what you just shared?
Yeah, listen, I think that it's shown once again that the United States is the indispensable partner. It's not that the United States can act alone. None of these actions that have been taken by the United States would have been possible without the collaboration, obviously, of the countries that are close to the conflict, the European nations of NATO. But it's also a question of the United States mobilizing public opinion. One of the most extraordinary things about what we've seen over the past 2 months is how the United States has essentially preempted Russia's moves by putting out information to global media about what they think Russia is trying to do. Now, it's not that that was successful in stopping Russia, but it established a credibility and a legitimacy for U.S. actions that has been very, very important in holding alliances together. The United States has been able to use its soft power capacities in that way extraordinarily effectively. What we're seeing right now, however, is a need for the United States to increase and improve what we call sharp power. So in international relations, we talk about hard power, which is sort of military power or threats of sanctions, soft power, which is about influence, and sharp power, which is the ability to penetrate inside a society and begin to change opinion there. And that's what the Russians have been very active in doing with their campaigns of disinformation, of course, for many years. Now we need to see how effective the United States and its allies are in terms of exercising sharp power inside Russia to begin to change public opinion there. That's, I think, where we're less effective. But in all of this, we cannot forget that, and Ben mentions it in the question, we cannot ignore the extraordinarily central role that China is playing in this. China is playing it very, very cautiously right now. Some people are saying they're celebrating this conflict in Europe. I see it very differently. I think that they see that this is highly disruptive at a time when China is vulnerable because of its shutdowns due to COVID. China wants economic growth, and all of this is bad news for China in the short term. Long term, it may present other opportunities, but I think that the United States is really testing its ability right now to get not just allies, but unfriendly nations to go along with it. And I'm not convinced that it's going to be successful, but I think that we have seen, and Ben's right in this, we have seen a renewed capacity of the United States to lead on a global stage.
Knowing all this we just talked about in terms of geopolitical political realities, the cybersecurity attacks, the energy, and all these things that are happening overseas in this interconnected global community we have, two-part question is, so what is it that they need to be thinking and doing right now to prepare, from your take? And are there any mistakes that you think that you've seen either in past events or you've seen right now of making a short-term decision that would actually not be good long-term because of these things? Let me start with you, Duncan. What's your guidance to the business community on that? And I'm including that broadly, nonprofit organizations, private.
Yeah. So listen, I think that the first thing that businesses should be thinking about at this point in time is getting a better grip on geopolitics, because ultimately it matters less whether or not you are a globalized firm, because these are all global phenomena that are going to impact upon your market. We're seeing it on, my father-in-law sent me a photograph today from Costco that a jar of crab meat is now $49.99, whereas a year ago it was $20. Who would have thought that crab meat produced here in the United States would be impacted by this, right? That's an extraordinary indicator, I think. So understand geopolitics a lot better. And of course, this is a very thinly veiled appeal for companies to engage with the Wilson Center, because it's one of the things that we do really well. But I think it's understanding how that plays through in your business strategy. In terms of the mistakes that have been made, Maury, I mean, the big mistakes that have been made are not specific investment decisions. I mean, you can say Nord Stream 2 ultimately was a horrible mistake. But go back 5 years, and I think you would have found a majority of people saying that makes sense. Yeah, there would have been voices out there saying you can't trust the Russians, and the Russians have, too strong a hold over your energy needs. But a lot of folks are out there saying that this makes sense just because of the price point there. But I think the big mistake was assuming that globalization as a phenomenon was going to continue, not indefinitely, but that it was, more or less saved. And that was because, we got through the Trump years where there was this assault on the idea of US integration with global markets, of free trade. We saw the assault on, first of all, on NAFTA, but then ultimately NAFTA was saved by the USMCA. And I think people breathed a sigh of relief. What we missed, I think, what a lot of people missed along the way was the fact that, you get a Biden administration coming in, which is really not any more friendly towards trade. And at the same time, geopolitical tensions have been ramping up, obviously with China, now with Russia. And we're seeing, nationalist movements coming to the fore in major partners of the United States, such as Mexico, for example. I mean, I study Mexico closely, and Mexico worries me a great deal in terms of what they're doing down there. They're deeply embedded in USMCA, but the current administration down there is seeking sovereignty, economic sovereignty in so many different ways that are actually contrary to not just the spirit, but also the letter of that USMCA. So understanding geopolitics, understanding national politics is one of the things that we really have to do a lot better.